I'm Chris Runge, and this is Study Hall. Welcome to Study Hall, the podcast dedicated to getting a little bit smarter about advertising. What's up, Study Hallers? It was my pleasure to have Dr. Terrence Kelly on the podcast this month after a lot of calendar and computer challenges, with which he was very patient. Here are some highlights.
What I see in the industry right now, and I'm working with a lot of VCs, I'm working with a lot of startups in various capacities. What I see is the ideas that are coming out of academic labs are fantastic. They're really clever. They're much more mature than they were 10 or 15 years ago in terms of mature being like almost business ready. So people are much more savvy about what it takes to convince investors to invest in stuff. You know, everybody loves the idea of being CEO of a company that they found and being the next Jeff Bezos. But realistically, most scientists I know, and I would even put myself in that category, we're not prepared to be the salespeople that you need to be a good CEO. But for me, the question of filling, the bank account at a certain point becomes the CEO's major job. And, that is not straightforward. You network, sending an email to info@vcnumber12.com is unlikely to get you very, very far. We had VCs who had invested. We had a strategic partner, and you talk to all of them about opening doors. I think the benefit of the VCs is that a successful VC is going to give you exposure to a lot of really, really important people in the industry. There's a shortage of I think, people who have been there, people who have done it, to sort of man these, to man the companies that are being started up.
What makes Dr. Kelly so interesting to us study hallers is that he's gone from the lab bench at a large pharma company to the C-suite at a biotech startup and offers some client-side insights into career path, leadership, and capital raising in the pharma world. And at the end, we even get into a short discussion on how marketing and advertising skills apply to early-stage pharma companies, which I hope you find enlightening. I did. So, who is Terrence Kelly? Well, Dr. Kelly has over 28 years of experience in the pharmaceutical industry in the U.S. and Europe. After finishing postdoctoral studies in 1990, he worked as a medicinal chemist at Boehringer Ingelheim on projects in the areas of immunology, virology, CNS, and cardiovascular diseases. From 2002 to 2009, he led BI's medicinal chemistry department in the U.S., which included 145 scientists in the high-throughput screening, computational chemistry, structural biology, combinatorial chemistry, and medicinal chemistry groups. Under his direction as project leader and as the department's vice president, the organization advanced multiple compounds into clinical development. Dr. Kelly is a co-author on over 25 scientific publications and served on the College of Natural Sciences Advisory Council for the University of Texas. He joined Comentus in 2010 as chief scientific officer and was responsible for the research and preclinical development activities in their portfolio of scientific programs and the partnership with Astellas Pharmaceuticals. Dr. Kelly was appointed by the board as president and CEO in November of 2011 and was responsible for the development and implementation of corporate strategy as well as fundraising activities and partnering. Since 2016, he's been consulting on startups and existing companies in the biotech field through his LLC. He's a board member of Cardax and Allocyte AG. At Cardax, a publicly traded company, Dr. Kelly also serves as chairman of the audit committee. And without further ado, here's the interview. So why don't we start at the beginning? How did you get into pharma research?
So I'm a scientist by training. I studied chemistry at RPI. I have a PhD in chemistry from the University of Texas. And when I was finishing up my graduate work, I talked to my advisor and I told him I either wanted to go into academic research or pharma research because I liked the idea of designing molecules and in a sense manipulating the very very smallest level of nature. We talked about what would be the next steps that would enable either of those, and I ended up taking a postdoc at Yale, and this was in the late 80s, early 90s. And at that point, the pharmaceutical industry was hiring chemists left and right. It was a great job market. And the offers I got from pharma were much more attractive, not just financially, but just in terms of what you're able to do, the resources that are at your disposal. And really sort of when I thought about specifically what I wanted to do, it was just the right environment for me.
Where did you start off studying?
I spent a long time working in immune-related diseases, and at the time that included HIV, was considered more of an immune disease as opposed to a viral disease. So I worked a little bit on HIV. I worked a little bit on just other immunological diseases such as arthritis and psoriasis. And most of my career at Boehringer, so at least the first 10 years when I was still running a research group, it was really focused on those sort of indications. So multiple sclerosis, psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, all of these have common underpinnings in the immune system and dysregulation of the immune system.
And so you're working away, you're at the lab bench, and then I guess eventually the idea occurred to you to start climbing the management ladder. How did that play out?
Well, I mean, I think, I think careers are 50% preparedness and 50% opportunities, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So I think anybody has the ability to demonstrate, leadership potential. And I think sometimes it's a misnomer that you want to pursue this path or you want to pursue that. But I think people tend to gravitate towards things where there's a need and where they have, certain skills. I think I was recognized not just for my science, but also for, the ability to work on a team, the ability to communicate fairly succinctly, some complex ideas. If you can reduce complex ideas to simple thoughts that people can understand, I think you'll be marked as a good communicator. And that's especially true in science. I mean, we all know the people who, when you ask them what time it is, they tell you how to build a clock, right?
Yes.
So you don't need that. Sometimes you just need the succinct answer, and you need to understand the level of the audience that you're speaking to. If you're speaking to a Nobel laureate, you have to talk in a certain way with a certain amount of detail. And if you're talking to, your grandmother who knows nothing about science, then you have to sort of be able to pull it really back and talk at a very high level. So I think that, those sort of skills were developed over time. They're certainly developed all through graduate school and postdoc. And I think that the industry I was in allowed for them to be recognized. And, I think I was, you think that companies have a plan, right? But they don't. But when a need arises, they look for suitable candidates. And, the company was growing so fast in the early 90s in the mid 90s that there were a lot of opportunities for, smaller groups to lead projects, to lead smaller groups. And, success at those levels gives you the opportunity to be considered at the next level. And eventually, I was a vice president of chemistry at Boehringer.
And so at that point, I'm sure you were looking at a fairly, you could have kept on that track, I'm sure, and had a fairly distinguished career, a very distinguished career. But at some point, you obviously decided running your own company was something you'd like to do. When did that first enter your mind?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it is opportunistic, right? So when I left Boehringer, it was it was during one of those phases where there were a lot of changes being moved on, and I was one of the people caught up in that. I had been fortunate that I had a lot of good contacts in the industry, and I essentially had a choice. Do I remain in the big pharma environment, or do I try something new? And one of the first things that came along was the opportunity to work as a chief science officer, so in charge of all of R&D, and to a certain extent the clinical side, at a biotech that was a well-funded biotech that was based in San Francisco. And it was really a fantastic fit for me because they had a major collaborator. They needed somebody with a background in chemistry because that was really the day-to-day problems they were fighting, and they wanted somebody who had experiences in large collaborations. Now, I had always been on the big side, the big partner side, but actually as a small company going in, having somebody with that experience really helped smooth out a lot of potential bumps in the road, because when big companies speak differently and move differently than smaller companies, and so having somebody who had been on both sides, I think had enabled me to make a fairly unique contribution. So I had been the chief science officer for, I think it was about 18 months. And then, unfortunately, the company hit a couple of problems with the people in the CEO role, that essentially opened the role. And at that point, the company was well funded. They didn't need to raise money, and they really weren't sure where they were going in the future. But they asked me to step in as the CEO role, and for the first year or so, I would say that it was just a continuation of my old role, but I was just being exposed a little bit more to the board dynamics, to the fundraising aspects. And then as we started turning over and starting to think about the next level or the next stage of the strategic direction, that's where sort of I needed to really learn the entrepreneurship side, really learn the venture side, really learn that a CEO's role is largely raising money in these small companies. And that, fortunately, I had a good board, very experienced, very willing to advise and help, and to open doors. And that's where, so that's sort of where the development took me.
So was there ever a point where you were sitting there trying to work out whether or not you wanted to stay as CSO or move over to CEO? Did that, and if that did occur, what was it like for you, and what kind of things did you think about as you were trying to decide whether or not you wanted to do it?
Well, I mean, I think always with my career, I think at a certain point you stop worrying about titles. And I'm certainly at that point right now. I work with a lot of companies, and I really don't care what the title is. I think what's important, especially at small companies, is that people realize that there are different formal roles, but everyone has to learn how to master everything, because if one person leaves, you can't have a big gap. You have to really be able to cover for each other. Right. So when they asked me, it wasn't completely unexpected. Unfortunately, my predecessor had become ill and passed away very, very quickly. And so it was clearly the organization was reeling a little bit from the loss of him. And he was a great man. I really miss him. But it was pretty clear that I was the other senior person on the management team, and that I was at least going to take an interim role of running the company, because 95% of the employees were effectively reporting into me anyway, because it's a small shop, right? And so they asked me to step in, and they quickly made it permanent. And then they gave me the guidance I needed to develop it. And I think that's where, you sort of early on in your career, and I was the same way. People are focused on the next promotion, right? They're focused on getting that raise, getting that promotion, getting the recognition. Yeah. But I think at some point, you just do what's necessary regardless. I mean, at the C level, in any company, you're going to be well compensated. So
Right.
it's really not about money per se, but what it really is about what's the need? Can you fill it? Are you the best person to fill it? Because we need this small venture to be successful, and you have to know when you are the right person and when you're not the right person.
I mean, was there anything that surprised you? I know you've been talking about how everybody covers for each other, and you kind of have to know everybody's role. But once you got into the CEO role, was there any moments where you thought, "Whoa, I didn't realize there was going to be this much of X," or "I had no idea Y was going to be so much of an issue"?
Yeah, so I mean, this is going to show you the naivete I had walking into this role, but
Mm-hmm.
I had no idea how much work it is to raise money. And maybe a large part of this was that I
Mm-hmm.
just had never been through it before. But when you work for when you work for a company that's well funded and has 10 billion or 20 billion in sales, I'm not going to say you don't worry about your budget, but you know that whatever budget gets approved, it's going to be funded, right?
Right.
But when you're in
Right.
a small company, and you obviously have to have extremely high budget discipline, but that wasn't really a problem. I think anyone with any operating experience would have that.
Right.
But for me, the question of filling, the bank account at a certain point becomes the CEO's major job. And, that is not straightforward. There are lots of ways. There are a lot of different types of investors. There are a lot of different ways to raise money. You need a mix of luck and great story, great management team. You need to have your current investors completely vested in the process. And there are a lot of different components that, having never been through this, that I had to sort of learn on the fly. I think I would have benefited from being the CSO under a CEO who had done this before, and having seen the whole process and being part of the team that did it, but maybe in the second chair, right?
Yep.
When you don't want to be, I don't want to say you don't want to be. I mean, I survived, obviously,
Yeah.
but it was a lot of spinning my wheels. The first time and the second time we went out to raise money, just because I had really no idea. I had no idea of valuation. I had no idea of what the different types of investors are looking for. And you had to learn. I was lucky. We had our current investors, or our investors at the time, were very supportive, and they were very willing to sit me down and explain, all of those things that they never teach you in an MBA course on venture capital. But it was certainly a learning experience, and I think I would have benefited from having at least been in the second chair one time through.
What would, like, I don't know, the top three things you would tell them about raising capital?
This is going to sound really simple, but until you're in that role, you probably don't think about it.
Yeah.
The most important thing in a CEO role is to have a very good relationship with your board, because especially in venture-backed firms, your board are the venture capitalists. You want to make sure that your understanding of capital raises and returns and timeframes is aligned with theirs. And, they may have, the different VCs on your board may have different midterm and long-term objectives. So you have to make sure that everyone's bought into what you're doing. I think that is fundamentally the most important thing. The second thing is you have to make sure that you have a very energized and passionate team, because you're selling. I mean, you're selling not just your science, you're selling your team's ability to deliver. And then you have to have, at least in the biotech world, you have to have a compelling story, and not fiction, but but you need a compelling story on why this is going to not only change the the world for patients, but why your product or your company or whatever your investment is, that's going to return money to the investors, because it's obvious, but your venture backers and your future investors, they may love the fact that they're helping patients, but their limited partners want to see a return. And so you always have to realize that their obligation is to their limited partners. Their limited partners' obligation is to the pension fund or whoever's at the base of the money that's being invested in your company. And so you have to not only compel them with the science, but you have to compel them with the investment thesis.
And so how does the capital raising conversation start? How do you approach capital? Do they approach you? How do you go from zero to sort of something in the capital raising world?
Well, it depends on what stage you're at, right?
Okay.
I mean, so we had been funded, the company had raised a fair amount of money. So we at least had, the previous generations of CEOs and business development had been through this. And so the company was known to the investment community, which was certainly an advantage.
Yeah.
And so you network, sending an email to info@ VC number 12.com is unlikely to get you very, very far.
Got it.
They want to look at things that they're interested in. So we had VCs who had invested. We had a strategic partner, and you talk to all of them about opening doors, because every VC who's ever been in a syndicate has people that they like to work with and they don't want to work with. And, the people they want to work with, they funnel investment opportunities to and say, hey, take a look at this. And so you sort of build that network, and you start from that small snowball, and you try to turn it into a boulder by just talking. And you're constantly on the phone. You're constantly talking to people. You're constantly getting feedback on your pitch. What do they like? What they don't like? So you're constantly editing it on the fly. And you spend a lot of time traveling and going into people's offices. In the U.S., it's primarily San Francisco and Boston, but there are other VC centers in the U.S.
When you're going into for these meetings, how long do they generally last?
So they can be as short as half an hour. They never go longer than an hour, at least not on the initial pitch.
I see.
And then if you get through the initial pitch, they'll send you over to their technical team, who will start asking questions. And then, keep asking questions. And the more they keep asking questions, eventually, you'll have to go under a CDA with them, because there's always some stuff you don't want to show. But you want to show them as much as you possibly can, and you really have to sort of make a strategic decision. What are really the crown jewels in our portfolio that we can't let anybody see until they're under a CDA? But the more you can talk openly with people prior to that, the more traction you're going to get. Because if you tell them, well, I'd love to tell you this is great, but I can't show you any data, you're not going to be invited back for further discussions.
I see. Yeah, I would imagine that. I'd imagine at a certain point they need to look under the hood. So when you're sort of thinking about the capital raise, we've sort of talked about who the players are, but let's take a little more of a detailed look at that. So who are the players? There's VC. There's who else is part of the game here?
Well, a lot depends on the stage that you're at. So a lot of small companies, so companies right out of an academic environment, for example, that are at a very, very early stage. You have the federal government, you have the SBIR program, you have the NIH. That's a great source of funding. It's also non-dilutive. There are foundations that give grants, and a very, very small company can do an incredible amount of money with a $200,000 grant, or a tremendous amount of science with a $200 grant from SBIR or something like that. and it's completely non-dilutive, so it's great.
Right. The
At a certain
non-diluted,
point,
just to be clear, that means it doesn't dilute your ownership interest in the company. They give you the
exactly. I
money,
mean,
and they don't ask for any equity.
I don't want to say it's free money, but it's
Right.
essentially it's a grant.
Right.
You don't have to pay it back. It's not a loan, and they don't want an equity stake. It's not an investment. It's a grant. So
Wow.
so that's the first part, and then a lot of small companies get started with angel money. These are typically high net worth individuals or family offices, and you might be able to cobble together a couple $1 million from them, um, which you'll get some money. It's not going to be, you're not going to get a lot of advice from those groups, probably because it's
Right.
a very small investment. But
What are angels normally looking for? Are they just looking to hit a home run, pretty much, or
um,
what are they looking for?
so I actually don't have a lot of experience with angels.
Oh, okay.
I think a lot of the family offices, so the angels that I'm associating with family offices, may have a particular area. Maybe a family member died of a certain type of cancer, so they have a
I see.
specific focus that they want to fund research in a certain area. The larger, more sophisticated family offices run sort of like VCs, where they may actually take a board seat and they may actually be willing to do a further investment in a company once it hits certain milestones. The VCs, I think, have a lot of, I think the benefit of the VCs is that a successful VC is going to give you exposure to a lot of really, really important people in the industry. So when you need to raise money, they'll have people that they've syndicated with before. When you need to talk to specific pharma companies because they might be interested in a collaboration or even buying your product or your early stage product and developing it for you, um, they know how to get to right to the decision makers. So you don't have to go through 6 layers of business development. You can go right to the decision makers, and
That's huge.
they also have a network of people who have been successful at C-level, the various C-levels, and they can supplement your management team with really experienced, good people who have been there, done that, and that's really valuable.
Yeah.
Now, VC money is what we would call expensive money because they're going to want a large chunk of your company from it. But it comes with a lot of pluses in terms of what they can develop for you. And then later on, once you get past sort of that venture growth phase, so you can think of the angels as being maybe up to $5 million. You can think of the VCs. Nowadays, VCs have large funds, so they can probably go up above 50 million. But typically, that's the number that I always sort of associate with VCs is somewhere between 20 and 15 million. And then above that, you can look at crossover investors, which are these are really big money management companies that invest in companies that are likely to go public at some point or be bought out someplace, but they'll do sort of a short, let's call it a 1 to 2 year investment window where they're expecting to get either liquidity or an immediate return. And then there are the public markets, which basically taking a company public gives you access to all sorts of capital because
Yeah.
there are a lot of sources of capital out there that have liquidity requirement. I mean, a large part of the hedge fund industry each of the funds have lots of money, but they also have liquidity. They can't invest in non-liquid assets, and a privately held pharma or biotech company, you can't liquidate that asset very easily.
Right.
So if it's publicly traded, at least their stock has a liquidity component to it, and that gives them that opens up a broad range of investors to you.
So let's turn back to the first raise that you were doing when you first started in the CEO role. So what would you say you got right about that raise, and what would you change if you could?
Well, I mean, I think I'm not sure a lot went right in that. I think what I took out of that was really the learning experience and just
Uh-huh.
just understanding what this is all about, right? I I think I understood a lot more about how to put together a pitch deck. I think I understood a lot more about how decisions on investment are made. We were not successful in our first attempt at this,
Mm-hmm.
but it exposed me to a lot of big players. And the pitches went fine. It just
Mm-hmm.
it was just not the right time. There were some structural issues with the company that I think eventually caused it to close, and made it a very difficult investment for folks.
I see.
But it wasn't, it was something that probably an experienced CEO would have picked up on.
Mm-hmm.
But at that point, I wasn't aware of it, but you learn it and you address it in the next round. So
I see. So listening to your answer, it sounds like being part of an unsuccessful pitch or a capital raise that doesn't go as planned. That doesn't necessarily hurt you with the the people you're talking to in the VC world. Is that my
no,
accurate?
I think you learn quickly who are the type of investors who might be interested.
Okay.
I think what it taught us was also that, maybe instead of pursuing a classic venture round, it made more sense to do a partnering with a pharma company
Ah.
and raise money that way.
Yep. Very
Uh,
popular
and
these days. It
and
seems
and I
like.
think that was essentially the route we were headed down
Mm-hmm.
before. In this case, we had a competitor who had was working on a similar project, and they had some failed phase 3 clinical trials, and that basically what was the end of the company. We just couldn't raise money or do a partnership after that.
Should it just shut down the whole category of therapy?
Yep, essentially, yeah.
Yeah, it's a shame. So I guess that's what you would change if you could, right? You'd look at the company structure a little more closely, and anything else you'd change?
Um, no, I think that we did the right things. I think
Mm-hmm.
it was just a hard sell.
Yeah, I hear you.
Sometimes you can do everything right. Look, this is
Yeah,
also part of the training in science, right? You can do everything right, and
yeah, that's
and
right.
it still doesn't work, right?
That's right. That's right. What would you? So, just turning quickly away from that whole the personal history. What would you if someone came to you today and said, "Hey, listen, Terry, I'm thinking about I've got an idea. It's a good story. I have no money." What would you tell that person?
Um, so it depends where they're coming from. What is their background? Are they a
Mm-hmm.
scientist? Do they want to stay in the science world?
Mm-hmm.
I would advise them to get advice. I would advise them to figure out how much money they need to get to
Mm-hmm.
the next compelling inflection point is the word that they use in the industry. But it's basically where you take your story from being worth $100 to $10,000, right? You get
Right.
that one piece of data that suddenly increases the value of your project, 10, 100, 1,000-fold. So I would really tell them to focus on raising the minimal amount of money, either through grants or whatever they can do, to get their story to the point where it's much more real. And once you
Mm-hmm.
can do that, then you can start leveraging your experience. So you're able to raise a small amount of money to bring it to this inflection point. Now you need a little bit bigger, and you take it to the next one. So I think that you want to bootstrap your way up, diluting yourself as little as possible, but you basically that's how you want to do it on the sort of the interplay between science and
Mm-hmm.
money. But what I would also tell them is to be really, really honest with yourself. What are you good at? What is it that you want to do? Everybody loves the idea of being CEO of a company that they found and being the next Jeff Bezos.
Right.
But realistically, most scientists I know, and I would even put myself in that category, were not prepared to be the salespeople that you need to be a good CEO.
Mm-hmm.
You can learn it,
Yep.
but it's not something that naturally comes comes, it's not something that comes natural, right? Because in science, you want to be a little bit cautious. You want to not
Absolutely.
over interpret data. But you have to sort of be a little bit more on the sales side. So you have to learn that. And sometimes I know scientists that fundamentally don't want to learn it. And so that you're not going to be a good CEO if you can't learn how to sell your stuff fairly aggressively at times.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's turn a little bit away from the capital raising story for a bit, and I just want to ask you about the research environment today. And I know you're out there. I know you're running your own consulting firm these days. But what's your opinion of what's going on in research these days?
I mean, I think it's fascinating. I mean, I think what I see in the industry right now, and I'm working with a lot of PCs, I'm working with a lot of startups in various
Mm-hmm.
capacities. Um, what I see is the ideas that are coming out of academic labs are fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
They're really clever. They're much more mature than they were 10 or 15 years ago in terms of mature being like almost business ready. So people are much more savvy about what it takes to to convince investors to invest in stuff.
Could you say more about that? Just
Um,
give me a contrast between say 15 years ago and today. What?
okay, so I mean, the joke used to be, 20 years ago that, you clone a gene, you can take the company public, right?
Uh,
It was almost that much of an overhype. Now I think now what I see coming out are, you see a range of stuff, right?
uh,
And they're at various levels of maturity. But I see a lot more projects where people have spent their grant money not just developing the brilliant idea, which is important. Don't I'm
yeah,
not saying you shouldn't do that,
of
but
course.
once they have that brilliant idea, they're spending their grant money um, backing it up with data. So that to me is a real uh, positive development, and it's going to make things a lot easier to fund because investors are all about mitigating risk.
Yeah.
And so they'll put in just enough money to get you to the next important experiment. And so if you can do those important experiments up front, either however you fund it, it makes the story it makes the story a lot more intelligent to investors. And it also convinces the investors that you're somebody who's going to be focused on doing the right thing and not just running experiment after experiment for the sake of keeping the company alive. Investors would fundamentally rather invest, let's call it $3 million and get a clean no than invest $3 million and then have to invest another 3 million and then another 3 million
Sure.
and not know which way it's going to go.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't
Fail
mind,
fast.
they don't love losing money, but they would rather lose a little bit of money
Then a lot.
than be on the hook for a lot of money that
Mm-hmm.
they don't know where it's going.
Sure.
And so if you can convince them that you're somebody who's focused on getting the answer, whether it supports your hypothesis or kills it, that's really important. So those are what I'm seeing a little bit on the academic side.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I mean by the maturity of the science that's
I
coming
see.
out. I see also I see that the venture funds in particular have raised enormous sums of money. I mean, enormous sums of money.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's money out there to invest. So you have the ideas, you have the potential sources of funding, and the third thing you need in any anything going back to the wealth of nations, you need the people, right?
Right.
And so that's where the shortage is right now. There's a shortage of I think people who have been there, people who have done it,
Mm-hmm.
to sort of man these um, to man the companies that are being started up.
Mm-hmm.
And I hear this from every VC I talk to, that they're really starved of people.
And is that where you play? Actually, is that where your consultancy plays? Are you?
Yeah, so that's kind of what I do. It depends on what the specific uh, project is,
Mm-hmm.
but I can help companies either by sitting on the boards, or I can be an interim CEO or CSO.
Mm-hmm.
I can help companies develop their pitch.
Mm-hmm.
I don't go out and raise money for companies directly.
Uh-huh.
I'm not a broker dealer, but I don't have a problem introducing them to people, and I don't have a problem helping them with their pitch. And those are sort of what I do right now. I mean, what the benefit for me is it also gives me an overview of what's going on. And
Yeah.
I expect at some point I will step into another operating role, but it
Uh-huh.
allows me to sort of date before I marry
Yeah, it's a great.
a little bit, and to see the group, to get to know them, to have them get to know me as well.
It's a great model. I mean, I think it's. I'm surprised it's not practiced more often at high levels, because it makes a lot of sense to understand the intangibles of someone before you settle in. I'm
Oh,
surprised it doesn't happen more often.
absolutely. I mean, so much of small, you need a team that works well together.
Yeah,
And the more you work with them, and the more you know about the people, and
you can't pick it up
the
off a
the
resume. It's impossible
every
to.
every resume I've ever seen looks great.
Yeah, me too. It's funny how that is. One thing that's been interesting to me lately, being on the advertising side and the marketing side, is that orphan drugs have made such a huge impact, and now orphan drugs are. I don't want to be flip and call them the flavor of the month, but orphan drugs have really sort of raised their profile dramatically. What are your thoughts on the future of orphan drugs, and do you think that's going to be as big a part of the industry as it is today, say 15 years from now?
Yeah, so I think you have to go back to the question of why, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the reason orphan drugs have made a big splash is largely because pharma had to abandon the blockbuster model, right?
Right.
So they realized that the chances of getting the next Lipitor, it's just not something you can build long-term sustainability off of. I mean, if you could do it, it's
Agreed.
great, but those drugs are few and far between,
Mm-hmm.
and that they're much better off playing in markets they where there are lower barriers to entry, and you can get a premium for life-saving, life-altering treatment. And the orphan drug market is perfectly set up for that. I mean, there are all sorts of benefits to going down an orphan drug path with FDA.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And, you also, typically the drugs that you're developing are for severe life-threatening indications. And if you they really do change people's lives when they hit the market. So there's a real benefit to the patient,
Mm-hmm.
and that carries the premium. So this was a model that a couple of companies did a good job developing, and a lot of people jump on the bandwagon, which is the way money moves. Money
Yeah,
follows
that's right.
money.
Uh,
Um,
It's a good.
but I think what the question is, what's the future? And I think there is there's no economy in the world. I mean, the world economy cannot support the future um, healthcare costs if it continues to go the way it currently is going, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's just not enough money in all the banks in the world to pay for this for the next century. So something's going to have to break, and I think pricing is probably where it's going to happen.
Hmm.
And so the returns on life-saving treatments should and probably will always command a premium, but it's the question is, how big is that premium going to be? And is it going to be at a break-even point for very, very small indications? And I don't have the answer to that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think that's where you should be looking for the answers, to see how that develops.
Mm-hmm.
And especially when you start thinking about diseases like cancer, which are being subdivided into more and more forms of cancer. Lung cancer is no longer just lung cancer.
That's right.
Breast cancer is no longer breast cancer. There are genetic signatures to different types of tumors. and they respond differently to different types of treatment and different combinations of treatment. And this is going to get more and more complicated. Right now, while there's money in the healthcare system, it can be afforded. But at some point, there will be a tipping point.
Like you say, pricing becomes a huge issue because to make the drugs profitable, they have to be priced at these astronomical levels. And you're right. I mean, eventually it's going to be very difficult to justify those premiums.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're seeing right now is, FDA, when they get an orphan indication, I think they're being pretty rigorous in terms of making sure that it really is an orphan indication, and it's not just a sub-indication of a really large group, right? And that people are trying to game the system a little bit.
Right, like as you say, in cancer, you're some tiny genetic signature cancer, when in fact it's a
when it can be used for everybody, right? So I think that these are some of the questions that are being asked and answered now.
So real quickly, stem cell therapy and personalized medicine. So I've heard it bandied about that this is the end of the pharma model. Well, now we're going to get some stem cells, and those are going to just build us new things they're not going to be broken, and that's how we're going to fix things from now on. And that's the end of the pharma model. What's your take on stem cell therapy and personalized medicine?
Well, so I mean, I don't have that much experience in this area, but I look at it. I look at your question a little bit differently, coming from running a research group. Over the past 30 years, I've seen so many technologies come that have promised to sort of change the way we do drug discovery, or will radically, unemploy every chemist on the earth, and they never come to fruition. And what you realize is that technology, when it hits, it's overhyped, and then it crashes, and then smart people start asking the question, well, what does this technology actually do, and where can it be applied? And then it tends to have a second renaissance where technology tends to be applied in very specific, meaningful, productive ways, and then it really becomes a catalyst for research, as opposed to just replacing the way we do things. It just adds more information or adds more analytics to the system, and you're making better decisions faster, and that's really where you want with technology. And I look at stem cell therapy much the same way. I look at the genomics and genetics revolutions in terms of personalizing medicine the same way. I see these as they're not going to replace everything, but what they're going to have are very, very meaningful, specific cases which can't be treated otherwise. They're going to be expensive. They're going to be complicated to administer. So if there's a small molecule pill or an antibody that does the same thing, that's going to be the preferred mode of treatment. But if there's nothing else that can be treated, it's worth the effort.
As you say, the pricing model and people's interest in cost-effective medicine, it may be better. You're right. It may be better to give people a super-duper NSAID as opposed to rebuild your knee cartilage.
Right.
For instance,
at least during the next phase, when it becomes more and more popular, at some point, somebody's going to figure out a way of making that cheaper than the NSAID. Well, it'll be harder to make it cheaper than aspirin, but
you never know.
We'll give them a couple of decades.
Yeah, exactly. So I have two more questions. So the first of my last two questions is, if you had, let's say, $10 million, where would you be putting it to work in the pharma industry today?
Maybe I'm a romantic, but I would be looking at really the large unmet medical diseases, unmet medical needs. I think that the things that pharma and the whole medicine industry have been able to tackle in the past 10 to 50 years it's really amazing
Yeah.
in terms of quality of life, in terms of longevity. But there are still a lot of diseases out there that haven't been solved. I personally have an interest in neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's or
Mm-hmm.
Parkinson's,
Mm-hmm.
multiple sclerosis to a certain degree as well as a neurodegenerative disease. I personally find the science and the tantalizing bits of research that keep coming out. Um, there's something in the back of my brain that says, okay, the pieces are coming together. What are the one or two pieces that we still need to solve these puzzles? Because you know, Alzheimer's could bankrupt countries in the next 50 years. So you can
Hmm.
think about, where can you really make an impact? And how do you do that? So for me, that's sort of where I would personally be looking, but
Mm-hmm.
you can make that argument for lots of different diseases and other parts of the medical field.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a therapeutics person, so that's where my scientific and
Yeah.
personal interests lie.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no shortage of medical needs out there right now.
Okay, so last question. As you know, Study Hall's we're a podcast about marketing and advertising. And where do you think, or is there a place for, or where does marketing and advertising sort of join early stage pharma? Is there a place for it? If you're in marketing and advertising, how should you be looking at early stage pharma? And is there a role, or is it just something to watch?
Oh, that's a good question. I haven't really thought about it. I mean, look, I think that if you're talking about the classic marketing,
Mm-hmm.
I think that marketing in the sense of product-based marketing, you need to have a product, right?
Of course, of
So
course.
so I think that's so in that way, I think it's kind of hard to see it sort of fit in. But I
Mm-hmm.
think that there are a lot of corollaries to what marketing is and the analytics that go into marketing that
Mm-hmm.
could really be beneficial to people like me and startups. And
Mm-hmm.
one is even just meaningful market analysis so that when you're talking to investors, you can sort of at least have a ballpark figure of what an exit would look like, what a sale would look like.
Mm-hmm.
So there are clearly analytics that could be contributed.
Mm-hmm.
But I think more broadly, you know, we all have to sell ourselves. We all have to sell our teams. We all have to sell our projects. And there are different ways of doing it. There are the people who have incredible energy, and there are people who tend to be a little bit more soft spoken. All of the approaches can work, but you have to develop a common message for your your company,
Mm-hmm.
and this goes beyond mission statements.
Right.
This basically, people just have to believe in what they're doing, and people have to be able to communicate to people and investors and to potential buyers and patients and your family. What is it that you're doing? Why is it important? And those sort of those sort of aspects of marketing, I think, are universal for anyone in any field, and are really really important to develop.
Yeah, I've thought often that the storytelling aspect of advertising and marketing could be beneficial to people at the early stages of their development. I know we were talking earlier about the story, capital T, capital S, the story of the company,
Right.
and putting all that together in a compelling way. I think say for example at a pitch deck, and I know there are people who do that. But that always kind of interested me. But I've it's always a question of working. So for instance, at where I came up on Madison Avenue, we never saw anything until it was a phase 3.
Right.
Never ever saw
Right.
something in a phase two, or if we did, it was because we were walking down the hallway and we passed the guy whose product was in phase two. That was not. It was
Right.
never. It was never part of the. It was never part of our world, and I always thought that. I always wondered if there was a role further down the chain because I always saw an opportunity for storytelling. I mean, that's one of the things I like most about advertising is it really is at a certain level storytelling, and
But
storytelling is an art that has a lot of applications.
absolutely, and I'll relay an anecdote. When I was a first year graduate student, walking out of a seminar that was really interesting science, but it was just all over the place. And there was a professor next to me, and he just looks at me and says, "Never forget, nothing destroys good science more than bad presentation." And he
Yeah,
was absolutely right. And
that's
it was a
true.
lesson that I learned very, very early on that you have to tell your story, and you have to be able to tell it succinctly and clearly.
Yeah, it's a necessity no matter where you are in the development of your product. Anyway, so hopefully here's to getting further down the chain. But anyway, well that's it. Those are my questions for you. I want to thanks so much for your time, Terry. It was
No
really
problem. I'm glad we finally got everything to work.
yeah.
Got let go before we got put on it.
Schedules and computers finally
Yeah.
all cooperated. Study Hall is sponsored by Douglas and Runge. Henry Veloso did the music. Thanks again for listening.